Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me here for this presentation. My name is Lisa Dazzle, and today I'm going to talk to you all about the psychology of oppression, specifically in the Black community. So, just a little bit about our agenda. First, I'm going to tell you about who I am. Then, we're going to do a brief activity. After, we're going to define oppression and then discuss the four components of oppression. After that, we're going to discuss the impacts of oppression, and then I'm going to provide just some brief questions for you all to test yourself. And then we're going to talk more specifically about internalized racial oppression. At the end, we're going to do a recap of all of the things that you all learned, and then I'm going to remind you all to please complete a brief survey. Okay, so who am I? Like I said earlier, my name is Lisa Dazzle. I'm a Black woman from New York City. I'm currently pursuing my doctoral degree in counseling psychology, and I'm a third-year student here at Iowa State. I'm also a graduate instructor for Introduction to African American Studies, so if you're ever interested, you can definitely take my course. I'm also a practicum counselor as well at the Student Counseling Service Center and at Mary Greeley Hospital. So nice to meet all of you. Okay, so jumping right in, what is oppression? I'd like you all to take 4 minutes to answer the following questions. First, what is oppression? Second, what are the impacts of oppression? And third, what are examples of oppression that you can think of? And don't worry, just write down whatever comes to your mind, what you think oppression is. You won't be tested on this in any way. So I'm going to start a timer and I'll let you know when that timer is up. You can start now. At this time, there is about 1.5 minutes left. Okay, at this time, please wrap up your thoughts. Okay, and just keep your writing, your reflection, whatever it is, close to you. We're going to come back to that a little later. So before we jump into defining and exploring oppression, I want to center our discussion in a lens of intersectionality. Some of you may have heard about intersectionality before. If so, great. If not, I'm going to tell you more about it, so no worries. So intersectionality is a lens to examine where power collides, interlocks, and intersects. The creator of the term intersectionality is Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar. When creating the term intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw specifically was thinking about Black women. So when Crenshaw talked about intersectionality, she basically talked about the intersecting of identities. So Black women being Black and also being a woman, they are facing double jeopardy in some ways. So the interlocking systems of oppression of racism and sexism both combine to create greater forms of oppression for Black women. And so intersectionality suggests that it's not simply that there's a problem about someone's race or a problem about someone's gender or a problem about someone's class or sexuality. In fact, we have to consider all of these identities whenever we're thinking about a situation or an experience that someone has faced. And so as we move forward into talking about oppression, I want you all to recognize that although I will be talking specifically about Black people's oppression in society, we also have to consider all of the other identities that Black people hold. So now, what is oppression? Oppression is the systematic subjugation of one group by a more societally powerful group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more societally powerful group. So what exactly does all of that mean? Oppression is essentially when one racial group, specifically since I'm talking about race, Black people, are subjugated by white people because Black people are seen as inferior, whereas white people are seen as superior. And so within our society, the most societally powerful group, white people, have access to social, economic, and political gains, which allow them to societally oppress Black people on every level, including social, economic, political, and you name it. So to oppress is to literally keep someone down, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color are all oppressed in white dominated society. So there are four components of oppression. The first is creation of prejudice, and this is when the oppressor group has the power to define the reality for themselves and for other people. So an example of creation of prejudice is the stereotypes that exist about Black people. So there are certain stereotypes that Black people are lazy, that Black people are violent, that Black people are criminals, and that Black people are supposedly more susceptible to certain chronic illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, and hypertension, right? These are myths that have been created by white society in order to continue to oppress the Black community. Next, we have internalized racial oppression. And internalized racial oppression is when the target group takes in and internalizes the negative messages about them, and they end up cooperating with their oppressors. So in other words, they end up thinking and acting like them. So what this looks like is if Black people see and hear that Black people are supposedly lazy, supposedly violent, supposedly aggressive, and then you have people who are Black who start to believe and hold that Black people are somehow more aggressive, more lazy, and just altogether inferior. That's what internalized racial oppression looks like. It's basically the acceptance of these negative myths. The next one is systems of oppression. So, genocide, harassment, and discrimination are systematic and institutionalized. And when something is systematic, that means it's working within a network of other things. That means that it's working on institutional levels and it's not just working at an individual level. And once things become systematic, the institutions and the people within the institutions then start to uphold them. And now, even if one individual actor is choosing to not participate in it, the systems, the institutions are still partaking in it. Next, we have socialization. And socialization is when members of both the oppressor and target groups are socialized to play their roles as normal and correct. So, this is where you have people abiding by that internalized racial oppressive ideology and buying into this false idea that Black people might be lazy, that Black people are inferior, and then they begin to act that way because they have internalized their oppression. Also, socialization comes with white privilege as well, where you may have white people really believing that they deserve more than people of color and Black people because they are white. And this is how you have people then acting on these ideas, these myths of superiority and inferiority. So now let's explain oppression and break it down as to why this occurs and how it's allowed to happen. So Sedanius and Prato in 2001 created a theory called social dominance theory. And what social dominance theory suggests is that group-based hierarchies are inevitable. And group-based hierarchies, you can think of these as hierarchies based on race, hierarchies based on gender, hierarchies based on race, or just arbitrary hierarchies, right? And Sedanius and Prato, using the social dominance theory, suggests that these kinds of hierarchies are inevitable, and our society then maintains these hierarchies at a system-wide level, but then these hierarchies are also maintained in an intergroup level, meaning between person to person, and then it's also maintained on the person level as well. So in society, on the system level, and individually, person to person. So social dominance theory also suggests that oppression can be explained and justified within our society using something called legitimizing myths. So legitimizing myths are inaccurate ideologies, they are stereotypes, prejudicial ideologies, and discriminatory ideologies that promote this idea of a supposedly high status group and a supposedly low status group. And it serves to justify society's oppressive behaviors, and it provides insight about what group society values and allocates their resources to. And ultimately, what legitimizing myths do is explain why society is the way it is. So if you sit back and think about what are the stereotypes that exist about different groups within our society, right? And you can think about this for Black people. You can think about this for Asians, you can think about this for Latinos, and what are those stereotypes that exist? Those are legitimizing myths, right? And so going back to the example that I talked about earlier, you can think of the myth that Black people are lazy, the myth that Black people are inferior, are not intelligent, right? These are all legitimizing myths that explain why society is the way it is and why oppression occurs. So now I want to show you a video of what oppression looks like. Okay, thank you for watching. Now I'm going to put on a 2-minute timer. I just want you all to write down your thoughts on the video, your thoughts, emotions, and your reactions to that video that we just watched. So I'm going to start the timer now. Okay, you can go ahead and wrap up your final thoughts. Okay, so the purpose of that video was to showcase what racial oppression looks like, right? When you have years and years of intentional systematic oppression that just continues, right? It starts to build up and it creates very real obstacles and roadblocks, right? And that video is just a very good example of what that looks like. So now I know we've talked about a few things so far, so I just want to give you all the opportunity to test yourself and just check in about the knowledge that you've just gained. So I've put some very calm test questions here, and you can take your time to answer them. I'm going to read them out loud and read the answer choices, and then give about a minute for you all to complete it, and then I'm going to show you what the answer is. So you can always pause the video at any point if you want to take more time to think about your answer. So first, Chandra is a queer, Black, visibly disabled woman. She enters a restaurant and the staff refuse to assign Chandra to a table. According to the intersectionality framework, which of Chandra's identities should we consider when taking into account the discrimination she has experienced? A. Chandra's blackness, B, Chandra's queerness, C, Chandra's disability, or D, all of the above? And I'll give you all about a minute to think about it, reread it for yourself, and answer it. Okay, so now I'm going to reveal the answer. Great job. It is all of the above, right? So remember, with intersectionality, this framework is a lens for us to consider the intersecting forms of oppression based on an individual's identity. So above, you see that Chandra is queer, Black, and visibly disabled, which means that whenever we're considering her particular oppression, we must always consider all three of her identities and any additional identities that we know as well, because all of these identities will be interacting, right? And you can't parcel out whether it's her blackness, her queerness, or her being a visibly disabled woman, or all three of them, that has impacted them refusing to let her into the restaurant and the discrimination that she has experienced. Okay, so next question. Within our society, members of the Black community are considered lazy, unintelligent, and violent. According to social dominance theory, what are these myths called? A, implicit myths, B, legitimizing myths, C, explicit myths, or D, social myths? Again, I'll give you all about a minute so that you can think about your answer. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you the answer. Great job. It was legitimizing myths. And remember that legitimizing myths are stereotypes, discriminatory ideologies, and prejudicial ideologies that serve to explain why society is the way it is. Now for the next question. We discussed 4 components that are present during oppression. Please name and describe the 4 components that we discussed. Again, I'm going to give you a minute and a half for this one. Okay, so go ahead and wrap up your thoughts on this question. I'm going to show the answers now. So great job. It was one, creation of prejudice, right? Think about this as the use of media to portray Black people and all non-white people in a inferior light. The second is internalized racial oppression, right? That's when the oppressed community accepts the myths about the community. Three is systems of oppression, right? When institutions and systems work to oppress the community, right? Or the oppressed group. And then socialization, when individuals in society begin to act in a way that conforms to this oppression. So now we're going to go into more detail about internalized racial oppression. So internalized racial oppression, as we've discussed before, is the incorporation and acceptance by individuals within an oppressed group of the prejudices against them within the dominant society. So what exactly does that mean? That means that, for instance, Black people may accept negative legitimizing ideologies that dominant society provides. So what does that mean? That means that Black people will accept the myths or might accept the myths that exist about the Black community, that they are lazy, that they are violent, that they are inferior. And of course, we all know that these are myths that exist about the Black community. However, these are pervasive myths that are rooted in the media, in all systems, really, right? And so when people have continuous access and exposure to these types of myths, they start to incorporate it and they start to believe it, unfortunately. So what are some of the impacts of internalized racial oppression? The first is self-blame, right? This is when individuals from the oppressed group start to blame their own group for the oppression that they face. So an example of this might be members of the Black community blaming Black people for the disproportionate healthcare disparities that exist now because of COVID. So I'm sure you all may have heard that Black people are dying at higher rates from COVID-19 in comparison to whites, right? And so self-blame from the part of Black people might look like Black people saying, it's Black people's fault that they're dying significantly more than white people because Black people's diet is so bad. That's blaming Black people because there are very real systemic factors such as environmental racism, healthcare disparities that go into these COVID-19 disproportionate death rates, right? And so when we blame Black people for supposedly their diet or for not eating well, right? That's blaming the victim. So next, self-hatred is another result of internalized racial oppression, right? Black people might hate themselves or not want to be a part of their own racial group. And they might also have low self-esteem as a result. So of course, you can imagine that if your group is being portrayed as negative in the media or negative within society, you're of course going to have some thoughts, some negative thoughts towards your group if you're always seeing these negative stereotypes. And it also brings you down because who wants to see negative things about their racial group? So next, there's also negative psychological and physical health outcomes such as OCD, anxiety, depression, as well as physical symptoms as well when people internalize racial oppression. And then there's also shame due to belonging to one's own racial group. And of course, that makes sense based on what we've talked about before in terms of how media portrays Black people, how society portrays Black people. Why would you want to be a part of your racial group if you're being portrayed in a negative light? And this is not all Black people, but when you think about the society that we live in and how pervasive these negative myths are about Black people, we can see why individuals internalize these forms of oppression. So now I'm going to show you a video of what internalized racial oppression looks like.
Ready, set, go. Our second major finding, even Black children as a whole have some bias toward whiteness, but far less than white children.
She'll be the smart child. And why is she the smart child?
Because she is white.
Okay, show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child?
Because she plays.
Well, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child?
Because she plays.
Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child?
Because she likes skating.
And show me the skin color you believe most teachers think looks bad on a girl.
I don't think it matters. Because I think each teacher wants to help a student learn either way what they look like. And it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside, it just matters what you look like on the inside.
Show me the good-looking child.
They look the same.
Yeah? Show me the child you would like as a classmate.
All of them.
You like all of them as classmates? Why do you say all of them?
Because I don't really care what color they have.
This 5-year-old girl gave some provocative answers during her test. I asked her about them later.
How about you? Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they asked what color adults don't like. Do you remember what you said? Which one? That's right, that's what you said. Why do you think adults don't like that color?
Dark.
Dark. And you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white-biased answers?
Show me the one you think most children would think looks bad on a boy.
More than 70% of the older black children chose the darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has a skin color most children don't like.
More than 61% of the younger black children chose the 2 darkest shades.
Show me the ugly child.
More than 57% of the younger black kids chose the 2 darkest shades. Dr. Spencer says the research shows the bias toward white is still very much part of our culture.
All kids are exposed to these stereotypes, but what's really significant here is that white children are learning or maintaining those stereotypes much more strongly than the African American children.
And that is our third finding, the finding that interested Dr. Spencer the most, that overall younger and older children keep the same patterns stereotyping. In other words, their ideas change little from age 5 to 10.
Ordinarily, by the time children are older, there's this sort of a natural filter, their own ways of thinking sort of aids them in sort of rethinking the extreme stereotypic sort of responses to become less highly biased.
That left Professor Spencer wondering what's causing this pattern. She speculates that kids are bombarded by stereotypical messages, and that adults in kids' lives have to fight to override the deluge. Black parents may be more diligent about that, while white parents may not notice the need.
The messages are the same for all children, and therefore the task is the same for all parents. Parents have to reframe what children experience.
We realize these findings may be disturbing and that some people will question this project's conclusions. What stereotypic messages are being sent in a country that elected a black man president?
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
Like all research projects, ours is not perfect. Some kids were told ahead of time they'd be asked about race. Some children identified as one race but came from biracial families, like this boy whose mom is white. But Professor Spencer tells us these are common issues in research and the results can still be trusted because of the sample size. To be clear, this is a scientifically informed and executed pilot study, which suggests the need for further research. The results point to major trends, but are not the definitive word on children and race. Still, they underline what Dr. Spencer sees as an alarming conclusion.
We are still living in a society where dark things are devalued and light things are valued.
The question we're left with is, where do we go from here? Anderson Cooper, CNN.
Okay, Again, thank you for watching that video. Now I'd like to give you all 2 minutes to just write down sorry about that, just write down what your thoughts are on that video. Okay, you can wrap up your thoughts now. So the purpose of that video was to demonstrate how internalized racial oppression really impacts Black people, right? So I want you all to also think about which children, right, we're operating from an internalized racially oppressive viewpoint. And of course, as we identify that, we're not blaming the children or we're not blaming the person that's holding these beliefs, right? Because it's not their fault. It's the way that our system and our society is built to make people feel like who they are is disgusting, or who they are is unwanted, or who they are is not loved or likable or cared for, right? And so in that video, you really see the impact of what it means for society to view you in that light, right? And how, of course, that would impact children's self-esteem. And like Dr. Spencer said, these children, their ideas of stereotypes, they don't change from 5 to 10, right? They actually hold these stereotypes. And that just shows how insidious stereotypes are and why it's so important for us as people to really recognize what stereotypes we hold and how we're moving, right? And how we operate with these stereotypes and with these biases, right? And we can only start to change this once we actually acknowledge the biases and the stereotypes that we ourselves hold about different groups, right? And so that's how change happens. However, I want you all to really take into consideration just the large impacts that internalized racial oppression has and the impact just of oppression as a whole. So now, just to recap everything that we did today, thank you all again for listening up until this point. Today, we defined oppression, right? You all wrote down your own definitions, and then we also talked about what other definitions for oppression are. We discussed 4 components of oppression. We talked about the impacts of oppression and we saw them as well. And then we discussed internalized racial oppression. So now we're at that point to recap. And I think you all did a great job, even though I didn't get a chance to interact with you all on that level. However, I really appreciate you all taking the time to watch this lecture, and just great job in general for being students in a pandemic, for still being present, and just for being here. Thank you. I appreciate it. If you have any questions or any comments or want to send me your free writes or comments from this lecture and from the activities, or if you want the links to the videos, all that good stuff, you can feel free to email me at ldazzell, DAZZELL, at iastate.edu. And you can also email questions, comments, or concerns and reactions as well. So lastly, there is a Qualtrics, right? There's a Qualtrics link that should be attached to this lecture. If you're feeling kind, please complete the Qualtrics link. I would love to know your feedback and any additional questions that you have as well. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope to hear from you all. Take care, everyone.